I actually, when I was 6 or 7, I lived in the Dominican Republic, which is next door to Haiti. I'm sort of wondering how, like, why you think that this model has not been more widely applied in the third world, given the fact that these policies can turn Haiti into Norway. I sort of want you to broaden your historical reading beyond Howard Zinn. Recommend a couple of books. I think Charles Beard's history. He was certainly a progressive, and so his histories, and you know, you'll find a lot of your perspective in early Beard work. I think, you know. Sure. Well, you know, again, if you don't, I mean, like, I'm sort of hearing these kinds of arguments from authority from you, and
like
it's
what?
very true.
Like what? What would be an argument from authority, I guess?
For example, you're like, America supported the whites in the Russian Civil War. All historical authorities.
How is that an argument from authority?
All historical authorities will agree with you.
Sorry.
And my point was that when I basically read the primary sources, I find that what was going on was, in fact, the reverse.
So the argument from authority is that I said something that most historians would agree with.
Yes,
so
that's
the problem is none of us, even me, the professional historian up here, has read those primary sources. Not many of them, at least not the way that you have.
No.
So you can't really test this.
Of course. You know, and it's sort of when you're basically sort of within the sort of narrative of like most historians appears to you as sort of as broad as the world. But for me, like this narrative that you're within, it's like, imagine if you'd grown up in the Soviet Union and you got everything you knew from the Great Soviet Encyclopedia, which is a work that actually exists. How would I sort of convince you that basically that narrative, which every Soviet historian believes in, is, you know, a fairy tale?
Wait.
Because I think that if you read primary sources from the period, you might change your very, I hesitate to say, your very linear perspective on what was going on there. I feel like in some ways you're sort of a prisoner of this kind of 20th century Cold War worldview, which is itself really an American propaganda construct. Suggesting that there are other ways to parse and understand these realities is like hard for someone, it's hard to convey to someone who doesn't seem to have that spirit of questioning per se. And so I think that you know, what I would recommend, honestly, like for you as a progressive intellectual, I guess, have you done a lot of like menial labor? Have you like, have you worked in factories and stuff or anything? It's not an argument. It's actually sort of, you know, because we live in very different realities, we can't really argue. And this is why, basically, rather than encouraging you to read right-wing materials, I want to encourage you to read older left-wing materials. I think that this will give you sort of a little bit more of a perspective of simply how different the time of your sort of, you know, like how different a thing unions were 100 years ago from now, and you seem to be sort of conflating that America with this America in many, many ways. And it's sort of, it's hard to like, that's kind of the best advice that I can give you on how to open your mind a little bit.
I agree with Curtis, of course, that do I think that people have a right to safety? Yeah, absolutely. Do I think that like having a harsher regime of policing is a particularly effective way of enforcing that? I think if you compare different cities in the U.S. With different levels, you know, different criminal justice policies, I'm not convinced of that. But hey, you know where you're really safe on the streets? Norway, Sweden, Finland, places like that, which have vastly more lenient, more humane, more minimalistic criminal justice systems.
What else is the difference between Chicago and Norway?
I think the difference that actually matters, you can tell yourself a just so story about culture or race that doesn't really make any sense, but I think the difference that's actually relevant is the reason that they can have a vastly more humane and minimalistic criminal justice system. Anders Breivik is getting out of prison eventually, and while he's still in, it's much nicer than American prisons. And they can also have a much lower rate of street violence, is that social democracy works. That having a big, expansive welfare state, regulatory state, tied to strong unions, with much more egalitarian social consequences, results in much less crime, even with a vastly more lenient criminal justice system, which I do think is a win for democracy.
So then another place with an unfortunately very high crime rate is Haiti. And as you may know, Haiti has been in the news lately because the State Department is proposing its nth invasion of Haiti. How would you propose applying your Norwegian model to Haiti?
Well, I think that Haiti makes my point, so thank you for that, as much as would be humanly possible to do with any example in the world, because if you wanted to pick the single country in the world that was least like a Nordic social democracy, it would be Haiti, which, frankly, vastly more closely resembles anarcho-capitalism.
Wait, run that last part past me again.
They have that Haiti. How much of a welfare state does Haiti have? How much of a regulatory state does Haiti have? One of the things in the WikiLeaks cables, the State Department cables that were released, that were leaked, is that there was an effort during the first Obama term to increase the minimum wage in Haiti to, I believe, the princely sum of about $5 US a day. That was successfully lobbied against, among others, by the American State Department on behalf of American companies. That's about as weak a regulatory state as you could hope for. Power is wildly dispersed. Again, this is one of the least social democratic countries on the planet.
Do you suppose that's a cause or an effect? Have you spent a lot of time in like the third world? Have you, like, I actually, when I was 6 or 7, I lived in the Dominican Republic, which is next door to Haiti. I'm sort of wondering why you think that this model has not been more widely applied in the third world, given the fact that these policies can turn Haiti into Norway.
Well, I don't think that your lived experience of being there is actually very relevant. I think what's relevant is the trivially available public data that you yourself just recited a minute ago, right? The nth intervention in Haiti that like Jean-Bertrand Aristide, when he ran for president of Haiti, his original campaign slogan, swear I'm not making this up, was that he wanted to raise the Haitian people from misery to poverty, right? This is a very unambitious reform program, right? This is the most minimal effort at some kind of lefty reform program you could get, but you try that shit in America's Monroe Doctrine backyard, and you end up getting stuff like Aristide being literally kidnapped and taken out of the country by U.S. Marines in 2004. You broaden your view beyond Haiti, and you start looking at the rest of the Western Hemisphere south of the United States. You see, for example, you want to talk about attempts to implement something like a Nordic model. You see Salvador Allende in Chile being a democratic socialist, get a president, being killed and removed in a coup that's very openly supported by the United States. You see that in Guatemala in '54. You see that versions of that in Haiti numerous times. This is not ancient Cold War history. I mentioned Haiti in 2004. We could also talk about Venezuela in 2002, unsuccessful attempt. We could also talk about Honduras in 2009.
Can we actually?
I think so. I think that there is a pattern that emerges here, and I understand you don't want to see it, but this is a really clear pattern.
The pattern is one that I'm sort of very familiar with from my experiences with Nate Reeder. My dad was a Foreign Service officer and worked in the State Department for many years. His first post was the Dominican Republic, which was the site of one of these interventions. I think it's very possible to take that view when you look at a sort of very high and blurry level at these things. When you sort of descend a little bit deeper into, for example, the Nelson Rockefeller era of, he was the coordinator of Inter-American Affairs, which means he was basically the sort of proconsul for Latin America. You'll see, for example, let's take, for example, the example of Allende versus Pinochet in Chile. What you'll see if you do what's called a prosopography, which is an analysis of social network connections, is that Allende is, I would say, much, much more of an American figure than Pinochet. Pinochet is a very Chilean figure. Even in Argentina, he would have been weird. Allende is a globalist. He's a member of basically the global Americanized elite. One time I had, in the early 2000s, before I acquired some of my political direction, I had a boss who was Brazilian. He was actually Brazilian Chinese. And one day he came to me and he's like, what's really strange is that, like, my wife is a documentary filmmaker, and so she's kind of part of this world, and she's like very Americanized, and she hates America. And my brother-in-law runs a video store, and he loves George W. Bush. And how does this come about? And I'm like, it's very simple. The most Americanized people in the world are the most anti-American. And you'll find this pattern. You'll find this pattern among kind of Latin American elites everywhere. And so, from my perspective, the State Department in its Latin American policies is actually very much guided by a sort of mix between kind of the orthodox school of Latin American studies kind of program that we've been hearing from you and reality. And so if you take, for example, the case of Aristide in Haiti, the idea of a $5 a day minimum wage in the country where the average wage is probably 75 cents a day would go very, very far toward ruining what is left of the Haitian economy. And when you look at Aristide in particular, there's a lot that reminds us of, for example, our good friend Comandante Chavez, and that Chavez managed to take Venezuela. Chavez managed to escape all of this alleged CIA ExxonMobil plotting and actually run his own country in Latin America, and with great advice from the more radical wing of the School of Latin American Studies and the Sandinistas, if you know the term, and all those kinds of people. And the result was that he basically took the country in Latin America with the most resources and turned it into this incredible pit. And so, the idea of doing that same kind of maneuver in a country without oil would have been, sort of extremely remarkable. And you can bet your socks that among the people in the State Department who sort of countenanced the withdrawal of Aristide, that there was not a Republican among them. There are no Republicans in the State Department, zero. Like, if they exist, they spend their time deep in the closet. Moreover, and I'd be happy to point you to a link that basically, far from being, you simply don't notice all of the times that, from this perspective, that America has gone out and evangelized the, quote, non-communist left. All of the, Kennedy going down to Latin America in the 60s and supporting opera, Alliance for Progress in Peru, and saying things like the only alternative to violent revolution is peaceful revolution. You're going to get a revolution whether you like it or not, guys. And, the sheer amount, this goes on with Wilson's intervention in Veracruz in Mexico, where Wilson basically, you have this Porfirio Diaz, who, basically anything that works in Mexico was either created by colonialism or by what were called the científicos of Diaz. Diaz retires, and he's like, okay, I want this guy, was it Maduro? Basically this other thug to replace me. And America is like, oh no, we must not have thugs. And so, you basically get this kind of classic Wilson-Debs split between American candidates in Mexico, where the Wilsonites support Cardenas and the real hotheads, the John Reed types, support Pancho Villa. Your heroes would definitely be on the Villa side. And the result is this incredible Mexican Civil War that kills like 2 or 3 million people and reduces the country to a state of anarchy that it has not yet escaped from. And so, when I compare, the America's guilt in promoting leftism in Latin America, which, by the way, goes all the way back to the original Monroe Doctrine, because the original Monroe Doctrine was a policy inspired by England. It was really an English policy that was treating us as a satellite state. And the goal of that policy was to assure commercial dominance for English merchants, capitalists, in Latin America. This is why soccer is such a big thing in Buenos Aires. And it worked very well at that. And the policy was basically no monarchs, no European monarchs in Latin America. Mm-hmm. And then the Brazilians tried to have their own monarchy, which was actually kind of freaking cool, being Emperor of Brazil and all of that. And then the policy was, of course, you had the affair of Maximilian in Mexico, which was only possible due to the Civil War. As soon as the Civil War is over, the Americans are like, hey, Louis Napoleon, like, didn't you read the paper? Like, we have a huge army here, and we're ready to invade Mexico if you don't get rid of this empire. So Mexico had to go back to, like, broken third world government. And so, the sort of influence of basically imposing leftist systems on what was originally the peaceful and happy empire of New Spain is, for me, basically the sort of cause of all these trouble.
Which is that if you look at economic models, what you have in a place like Haiti is the polar opposite of something like the Nordic countries with their strong labor unions, strong regulatory state, extremely expansive welfare state, and the latter works a whole lot better than the former in delivering those basic goods of a more reasonable, less authoritarian criminal justice system married to a low crime rate.
And you really think that nobody has ever had the idea of using the Norwegian system of government in Haiti? Like, you're convinced of that?
When on earth did I say that? Did I just say that and black out? I never. In fact, what I said is almost literally the opposite of that, Curtis. What I said is that attempts at doing things that fall way short of that were not allowed to happen.
If we go back to the Haitian Revolution, my God, certainly that was allowed to happen. That was some pretty. You should read Lothrop Stoddard's The French Revolution in Saint Domingo.
Typically, we talk about social democracy. We're talking about reforms, rather than revolution. I think if we're going to be historically specific, that's what we're talking about. And certainly, in those countries over which America has expressed the most economic and political dominance, any attempts at doing anything that would be even close to what we have in the United States, never mind this kind of more extensive democracy, has been often met with quite a bit of hostility. And that is a major reason why it's been so difficult to implement that in Latin America.
Can I offer an alternate reason for that?
Sure.
I would say the alternate reason for that is that the farther you go from Norway, the more transparently insane these policies are. I would love to make you like the dictator of Haiti for a year or two. You should actually look into the 1920s and 30s occupation of Haiti, because I think that if you read primary sources from the period, you might change your very I hesitate to say, your very linear perspective on what was going on there. I feel like in some ways you're sort of a prisoner of this kind of 20th century Cold War worldview, which is itself really an American propaganda construct. What's your best example of third world socialism?
So when you say third world...
I mean, not Norway.
Not Norway. They have a so why is it, tell me your story about why you think that what's effective in Europe can't be effective outside of Europe, because I've been really unclear about this whole time.
Wow, that's a really interesting question. Let's take Japan and Haiti as our examples, because they're both island nations, and they both, one of them is very economically successful and the other one isn't. So if we could say, well, the infrastructure in Japan is much better than the infrastructure in Haiti. So what would be your expectation if leaving the governments of both countries the same, we transport all the Haitians to Japan and all the Japanese people to Haiti?
So is there going to be an answer to the question I just asked that's like come in through Socratic dialogue, or are we going to get to it?
Yes. Give me your answer first.
What's my answer for?
What's your answer for
why there's better infrastructure in Japan
my
than
answer
Haiti?
is the same answer given by Joseph Dermaestre, 200 years ago, when someone talked to him about the human race and human rights, and his answer is that he had never met a human. He had met Russians and Frenchmen and Englishmen, but as far as these humans, he had no evidence of them whatsoever.
So it's just about the innate difference between Japanese people and Haitian people?
Innate difference or cultural difference, Curtis?
Innate difference or cultural difference? Design an experiment to separate the two, and then I'll tell you.
Okay, there we go. That's an interesting answer. So I think that's certainly part of the answer. And by the way, useful to this comparison to know which one of those countries is more internally democratic. Not even close, right? Japan is vastly more internally democratic.
How do you define? I really want to get back to this definition of democracy, because in Japan, has been a one-party state since 1945. It's been run by the Liberal Democratic Party, and it's been run specifically by the LDP bureaucracy, which is one of the most famous bureaucracies in the world. And so, over which the electorate seems to have absolutely no control whatsoever. So how you define Japan as very democratic, I think would get into this.
Japan is much more democratic than Haiti.
I know. I'm getting you to answer the question.
I didn't say very democratic, and I answered your question like half an hour ago, but I'll answer it again. They have that democracy is about the empowerment of the public to have more influence over policy, to have ways of getting their will done, and the accountability of decision makers to the governed. Now, again, it's a spectrum. I did not say Japan is very democratic. I said it's vastly more democratic than Haiti.
Do you think that the construction of this popular consensus, and this is sort of what I really want to get into in the difference between populism and democracy and managed democracy, as your George Soros men will call, for example, what's going on in Hungary. So one of the things that's very clearly established by the 20th century is that essentially control of the media allows you to control public opinion. Public opinion is not a cause but an effect. If you had basically all of mainstream journalism in the United States had somehow been Nazi for the last 30 years, everybody would be a Nazi. And so when you basically sort of punt things like, and I happen to, just personally agree with this particular decision on gay marriage, but that's sort of neither here nor there. When I look at basically how public opinion is changed, and to borrow a nice word from Noam Chomsky, manufactured, of course Chomsky is really going back to Lippmann when he refers to manufacturing consent. What I see is simply a machine that could manufacture consent for really just about anything.
Yeah. Fortunately, that's not true, and I think we have evidence that that's not true. That in some of the very examples that we just went over. So I think that, for example, it's not the case that 12% more Americans support diplomacy in Ukraine than oppose it. Because, the New York Times and all those people you call the cathedral have been so relentlessly advocating peace and de-escalation in Ukraine. I missed that.
I think
when that
supporting
happened.
diplomacy for most people means supporting the State Department, which is not.
I think if you look at the wording of the poll questions, that was specifically even if there were territorial concessions involved. I think that something like the $15 minimum wage example. I think that's I think there are a lot of cases in which, look, does propaganda work? Sure. It often works for a long time. It's variable. It depends on the issue. It depends on a lot of other factors. I don't think that seeing the media and academia as being sort of omnipotent over public opinion is particularly accurate. I think it captures part of a complex reality, but I also think it misses a lot of it.
Ben, how many Americans do you think are capable of being democratic? Or would be interested in being democratic? Would be interested or capable in participating in a real way that you would respect in governance?
Yeah, I mean, I think it's already the case that Americans do have some avenues for public participation, and I think that's a good thing. I think that there are other avenues that we could have, for example, by having a much stronger labor union movement. This has historically been a hugely important way for ordinary working class people to have more influence collectively over the political process. That somebody like LBJ was mentioned.
Can I speak to that for a moment?
In a moment, you can. Yeah.
If they agree with the union.
It's not an argument. It's actually sort of, because we live in very different realities, we can't really argue. And this is why, basically, rather than encouraging you to read right-wing materials, I want to encourage you to read older left-wing materials. I think that this will give you sort of a little bit more of a perspective of simply how different the time of your sort of, like how different a thing unions were 100 years ago from now, and you seem to be sort of conflating that America with this America in many, many ways. And it's hard to that's kind of the best advice that I can give you on how to open your mind a little bit.